Julia Turner had never imagined that a simple locket could hold such a deep and powerful secret. It was a chilly October morning when she entered the Boston Historical Museum for the most important interview of her life. Hidden at the bottom of her grandmother's jewelry box, inside the case where the locket was kept, there was a letter. "This locket belonged to the love of my life, lost in the war," the letter read, written in shaky handwriting. With the locket around her neck, Julia entered the imposing museum building. Unbeknownst to her, fate was about to unveil a forgotten chapter of her family history. The entrance hall, with its tall columns and shining marble, seemed even more intimidating as she approached the reception desk. "You must be Julia Turner. Mr. Anderson is waiting for you," said the receptionist with a welcoming smile. Julia Turner, a 42-year-old woman with a fierce passion for history, lived in a modest apartment in Boston, surrounded by old books, black and white photographs, and a small collection of historical artifacts she had been gathering since her youth. She was gearing up for a job interview at the Historical Museum, one of the city's most prestigious museums. This job was her dream, a unique opportunity to delve deeper into the local history she so dearly loved. On the morning of the interview, Julia was nervous but determined. She woke up early, had a quick coffee, and reviewed her notes one last time. As she dressed, her eyes landed on an old locket that belonged to her grandmother, Margaret. The locket, with a beautiful green stone embedded at its center, had always been a talisman of luck for her grandmother. Julia never left home without it when she needed an extra bit of courage. She opened the velvet box where she kept the locket and held it for a moment, feeling its familiar weight. "Give me luck today, Grandma," she whispered, placing it around her neck. The warmth of the metal against her skin brought a sense of comfort and confidence. As she walked to the museum, Julia pondered the history of the locket. Her grandmother always spoke of it with a mix of nostalgia and sadness, mentioning a lost love during her youth. Margaret had met a young man during World War II, and though they were engaged, the war separated them, and they never saw each other again. Julia never knew the details, but she felt a deep connection to that piece of her family history. Arriving at the Boston Historical Museum, Julia took a deep breath and entered. The receptionist, a young woman named Emily, greeted her with a warm smile. "You must be Julia Turner. Mr. Anderson is waiting for you. Please go up to the second floor, room 203. Julia thanked her and proceeded through the grand hall of the museum, admiring the exhibits as she passed. She was awed by the grandeur of the place, feeling even more determined to land the job. When finally called in, she entered the interview room where she was greeted by a tall man with graying hair and a keen gaze, Mr. Anderson, the museum's chief curator. "Good morning, Miss Turner. Please have a seat," Mr. Anderson said, indicating the chair in front of him. He had a firm, yet friendly voice. "Good morning, Mr. Anderson. Thank you for this opportunity," Julia replied, trying to hide her anxiety. During the interview, Julia passionately discussed Boston's history, highlighting events and characters that were often overlooked. "I believe local history is the soul of any community," she said. "Understanding our roots helps us know who we are and where we are going." She knew her thorough research and love for local history would impress anyone. But what she didn't expect was the look of surprise and interest on Mr. Anderson's face when he noticed the locket around her neck. "That locket is fascinating," he said, leaning in for a better look. "May I ask where it came from?" Julia recounted the story her grandmother had told her countless times, about the locket being a gift from a youthful love lost during World War II. "My grandmother always said it brought her luck, and I hope it does the same for me today," she explained. Mr. Anderson seemed intrigued, almost moved as he listened. "That's an incredible story. Interestingly, I have a locket very similar to that," he said, his eyes twinkling. "But that's a conversation for another time. Let's continue with the interview." During the interview, Julia Turner and Mr. Anderson felt an immediate connection. As they talked, they discovered common interests in local history and the preservation of family memories. Julia spoke passionately about forgotten historical events, and Mr. Anderson added anecdotes and details only a true enthusiast would know. They exchanged stories and laughed over coincidences in their experiences. After the interview, Mr. Anderson asked Julia to stay a little longer to discuss something personal. "I don't do this with every candidate, but your story deeply touched me," he said, pulling out a small velvet box from a drawer. Inside, there was a locket nearly identical to Julia's. "This locket belonged to my grandfather," he said. "He always talked about a woman he deeply loved during the war. They were separated by circumstances, and he never saw her again." Julia felt a chill run down her spine. The coincidences were too much to ignore. I recognize that locket. My grandmother always talked about the man who gave her an identical locket." Mr. Anderson pulled out an old photo of his young grandfather alongside a woman. Julia immediately recognized the woman. It was her grandmother, Margaret. "This is unbelievable," she said, her voice trembling. "That's my grandmother, Margaret." Mr. Anderson, whose full name was William Anderson, looked from the photo to Julia. "It seems our fates were meant to intersect. Who would have thought a simple locket could lead us to discover such an important part of our family histories?" Julia and William spent hours discussing their family histories. "My grandfather, Richard, always spoke of Margaret with such fondness," William said. "He told me they were engaged and planned to marry after the war, but he was called up and never managed to find her after the conflict." "My grandmother always held out hope of reuniting with him," said Julia. "She told stories about what a kind and brave man he was. They exchanged these lockets as a symbol of their eternal love. They discovered their grandparents were engaged before the war and planned to marry, but fate separated them. The lockets were gifts they exchanged as symbols of their eternal love. For Julia, this was more than a coincidence. It was a sign that unfinished stories could find an ending, even after many years." William was equally moved. Both felt this discovery was not just a piece of history, but a profound personal connection. "Amazing how fate works," said William, looking at Julia. "Somehow, it seems our grandparents wanted us to find this connection." Hours after the whole event, the job offer was confirmed right there. Besides all the coincidences, it was clear that Julia was the perfect fit for the position. Beyond her extensive knowledge, she was passionate about what she did and perfectly matched everything William had required for the role. Julia was now part of the museum. But the story didn't end there. As the weeks passed, she and William began spending more time together, exploring not just the museum's artifacts, but also the details of their family stories. Both were widowers, and despite the pain of their losses, found comfort in each other's company. Gradually, what started as a friendship based on a historical connection turned into something deeper. They began to see in each other a second chance at love, something their souls had longed for. "I never thought I would find someone with whom I could connect so deeply," said Julia one evening as they walked through the park near the museum. "Neither did I," replied William, "but it seems our grandparents had other plans for us." Julia and William decided to create a special exhibition at the museum, dedicated to the personal stories behind the artifacts. They started with the lockets and the interrupted love story of their grandparents. "I think many people will relate to these stories," said Julia, while they organized the objects. But the biggest revelation was yet to come. During their research and the search for other objects for the exhibition, William found some lost letters written by his grandfather to Margaret, likely returned because they couldn't find the final destination, or perhaps an attempt to express all the love held inside. In one of the letters, it was revealed that he had survived the war and would look for Margaret until the end of his life, but he never managed to find her. "I can't believe you found this," said Julia, with tears in her eyes, as she read the letter in front of William. He never gave up on her. Both were moved to discover that, even though separated, their grandparents had never stopped loving each other. "This explains so much," William said. "They truly had a love that transcended time." "I feel like they are here with us," Julia added, squeezing William's hand. This discovery brought a new layer of meaning to their own feelings. They knew that somehow their grandparents were watching over them, guiding them to find the love that had been denied to them. The exhibit not only attracted the attention of visitors, but also brought to light many other forgotten stories of love and loss. People from all over the city began to share their own stories and artifacts, enriching the museum's collection even further. The opening event was a huge success. Julia and William stood together on stage, sharing the incredible journey that brought them together. "It's a privilege to share this story," Julia told the audience. "I hope it inspires everyone to cherish their own stories and family connections." The audience was moved, many with tears in their eyes, hearing how fate had united two families separated by war. Over time, Julia and William realized they were living a modern-day fairy tale. What began as a coincidence based on historical artifacts turned into a deep emotional bond. They decided to follow in their grandparents' footsteps and get married. The wedding was a small ceremony held at the museum, surrounded by friends, family, and the artifacts that told their stories. "I never imagined I'd be here, sharing this moment with someone so special," William said, holding Julia's hands. "Me neither," Julia replied. "But it seems our grandparents knew exactly what they were doing." The lockets were exchanged again, this time symbolizing not just their grandparents' love, but also the new love that had blossomed between them. "Now these lockets have even more meaning," said Julia, moved. Julia and William moved in together, not just as a couple, but as custodians of a history that transcended generations. They continued to work at the museum, preserving and sharing stories that inspired others to believe in the power of love and fate. "Every day is a new opportunity to discover something wonderful," Julia said, "and I'm grateful for every moment by your side." The exhibition of objects telling stories of love became one of the museum's most popular attractions, drawing visitors of all ages from various places. Julia and William, now in their 50s, had found the happiness they thought was lost. As they walked through the museum hand in hand, they knew their stories were intertwined forever, just like the lockets they carried.